The next session is titled Building Ecosystems for Community Level Impact and Population Level Scale. Building ecosystems for community level impact and population level scale involves creating strong collaborative networks among local organizations, government, and other stakeholders to address community needs holistically. I would like to call on stage the panelists for the day for this session. Dr. Alaa Murabit, Global Managing Partner, 500 Global. Nishant Pandey, CEO, American India Foundation. Nitida Wongthipkongka, Senior Venture Director, Rippleworks. The session will be moderated by Balaji Ganapathy, Founder, Social Positive, former Chief Social Responsibility Officer, TCS.
Okay, good afternoon. I think we may need a little bit more energy. I told these folks that, India is the place to be, and that there's so much of vibrance and energy in the room. So let's try this again for the sake of my honor, okay? Good afternoon. Okay. It's going to be, I know a lot of you have expectations that are sky high, so no pressure. I think what we will try and do, this is a pretty heavy topic in terms of what you can think in terms of whether we go deeper into what does grassroots impact mean, or what does scale mean, what does scaling along with impact mean, what does that mean in terms of individual organizations or collectively what we do. So there's a lot of ways we can go about it. We would love to hear from you. So what we're going to do is to bring up a QR code where you can submit your questions, and I've been given the authority to decide whether I should ask the panel questions we prepared for or those questions. So it's going to be very dynamic, okay? So do send us your questions in terms of why you're here. What do you want to take here? What do you want to learn about? And during that time that you share your questions, we will try and get started on a few things, which I think this panel behind the scenes had fun talking about. Let me set the context. We all know about the macro picture that globally, post-pandemic, the gap to fill the SDGs is about 4.2 trillion annually, right? About 30 trillion till 2030 in terms of addressing and meeting the SDGs, just in terms of pure capital. We also know that the lower to middle income countries around the world are facing the biggest challenge because a huge portion of money that they have to dedicate to is to fulfill their debt, paying interest on the debt, right? So this is the macro picture. And during that time, the international systems are going through quite a bit of strain in terms of changing from a multilateral system that was led by UN and other organizations to more regional organizations that are being set up and run. And you'll hear a few stories around that, I'm sure, as we unpack some of these topics. But within that story, you will also recognize the macro picture that capital is not really the big challenge, right? There is capital that exists, but mobilizing that capital in different forms and matching it against the need and doing it in a way where you can do it, keeping the community at the center of what you want to do is going to be the greater challenge. And the beautiful thing, if you look at it from the Indian context, is we are sort of rising at a time when a lot of these systems and ways of work have been tested. And even if you look at the Viksit Bharat and what we plan for at India at 100, or even if you look at current year numbers, the gap for SDGs in India is only about $300 billion, right? So CSR money alone cannot fill that gap, but private capital, if you see, it's about $14 trillion in India. So there is money available. There is clearly an opportunity to fill the gaps in terms of development in India. So what do we need is probably to understand from the outside in and also from the inside out, what sort of innovative models can we bring to pool capital, to look at resources beyond money, to look at partnerships, and create alignment so that we can really fulfill the aspiration. So before my first question, I'm going to just share with you one story to set the context, okay? We're talking about this macro and high-level view of things. I landed in Delhi early yesterday morning, and as luck would have it, the Uber driver who drove me to Habitat, I usually converse with folks I ride with, so I started conversing with him, and his name is Ratnesh. And as, I don't know, it's coincidental and providential. I was asking what you're doing, why you're driving this, and he was talking about, the fact that he's just doing it for a couple of months. He's been doing different things over the years, and he plans to return back home. I said, where is home? Bundelkhand. Okay, what do you plan to do? I plan to set up an NGO. That got me intrigued. Okay, you plan to set up an NGO. Why and what will you be doing? And he said that, look, I'm the child of somebody who was murdered because of violence. And as I grew up, my family faced a lot of ostracization. And I know what it takes to bridge the gaps there. And I would like to give back in that manner. My mother is going to retire from being a nurse in the public system, and there's going to be a pool of money that's going to come. So I'm going to set up an NGO and I'm going to do this work. And I'll come back to Ratnakar's story at different points in this conversation, because I think his realization that his personal experience and what he can do at his community level, at the grassroots level, to create the impact is the story of the aspiration that India has and the belief that there is solution available at a local level. There is intent, and we'll go unpack that a bit as we go along. So first set of topics we'll talk about is on capital. Okay, let me throw this question at you, Alaa. Help this audience understand. We hear all these fancy terms, right? Blended capital, risk first, bonds, impact investing. How are these different forms of capital really making innovation and grassroots impact come to life?
I'm actually really curious about the rest of his story. So I think you've spoken more to your Uber driver than I know about some of my siblings. But it's a little bit of background about myself. I'm a physician by background. And I first got involved in kind of community action when I was 21. I founded an organization that was committed to women, peace, and security. So women's inclusion and leadership in the midst of a civil war and in a conflict. And that was back in 2011. And from there I went on to advise the UN Security Council, co-wrote and advocated for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and served as the UN High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth. And then went on to serve as a director at the Gates Foundation and had a few other roles in between where I worked with the private sector to really engage them on the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I mention all of this, and I now serve as a managing partner at 500 Global, really building out our sustainable growth practice, which looks precisely at how do you take different partners and different forms of capital and make them greater than the sum of their parts. For a lot of us who have worked in the nonprofit or philanthropic spaces, there's often a question of what does this ladder up to? It feels like a drop in the bucket a lot of the times. And we talk a lot about the importance of sovereign scale. So if you really want something to scale when it comes to development, oftentimes you need to be able to tap into national budgets, national procurement, national regulation. There has to be some lens to government partnership for sustainability. And the challenge there is governments don't often have the resources to do that. And if they do have the resources, the regulatory or procurement mechanisms need a lot of support. And oftentimes that has been external. You've had intermediaries, you've had different organizations or partnerships. You've had multilateral funds that have helped bridge some of that gap. But what you haven't necessarily had is as much of that nationally kind of owned and maintained and sustained financing partnerships or mechanisms. And the challenge there is, as we've seen in the past, I would say particularly 18 months, this move from multilateral financing and institutions to more of bilateral investment plus aid models, we're seeing a lot more requests for governments to be able to say, okay, how is this financing going to be sustainable? And a recognition that you should be able to leverage all of your different capital stacks or pools of financing. So you'll usually have your kind of more risk comfortable financing. That's your philanthropies, your foundations, some of your family offices that are more willing to say, you know what, I actually don't want a return on this. My focus really is social impact or developmental metrics. But a recognition that that's money that gets to de-risk your other pools of capital, which is usually your kind of return-seeking capital, so a lot of your private sector, commercial, corporate, and then you have things like development finance institutions, you have your multilateral development banks, you have some of your multilateral institutions that are meant to help create private markets. They might want some return, but they're also open to lower returns, right? A recognition that you make some trade-offs to get impact. And so blended vehicles are really when you're able to take those three groups and say, okay, philanthropy, we really need your dollars to attract private sector. So rather than a philanthropy putting in 20 million for a project and only being able to pay for what that 20 million can cost for, you say, I'm going to spend your money to get a 1-to-7 leverage or a 1-to-5 leverage. And you're going to use that 20 million and go to private sector and say, listen, a lot of the enablers that we're going to need to pay for some of these private sector partners to be successful, for this to be really effective and create revolving capital for the community, that's what that philanthropic capital will cover. They will take on the risk. So you will get reward and will be able to create some social impact and benefit. So that's really the model of kind of blended finance. And it has existed. This is the interesting thing. It's existed for a very long time. We've actually had really great blended finance vehicles. The challenge has been that, and I love that the question talks about community level impact and scale, because people often complicate impact and scale and assume they're the same things. A lot of those blended vehicles have really focused more at the impact level or have been bilateral. Very rarely have we seen at the multilateral level very significant blended finance vehicles that leverage all three tranches to be able to deliver sustainable financing.
When you think about a good example of that, what comes to mind?
Of local or what it could look
like? Of a
like?
good blended finance model. Help paint a picture. Because
I think
the challenge, let me tell you, having sat in the seat of one of the largest private sector organizations and leading the foundation as well as the CSR efforts, a lot of the traditional view, there is the new view of pool capital and blended, but also the reality that a lot of the social impact work happens in communities where NGOs are looking for funding and capital in the form of CSR funds and philanthropic grants, right? So keeping that in mind, what would be a good example to help us think, okay, let's go beyond this?
I actually think a great example is health innovations. If you look at kind of the value chain for health outcomes, what you really need to be able to invest in isn't just health R&D. You need to be able to invest in the full delivery chain. So what does mobility look like? Logistics, et cetera. So if you think about blended finance as being mission specific but sector agnostic. So if I'm creating a health financing facility, for example, I'm not going to say what I really need is only vaccines and different medications, therapeutics, diagnostics. What I will say is actually my market failure is getting this to the delivery line. So then I'm talking about a vehicle where some of your commercial capital might go into investing in the R&D and investing in the higher cost or deep tech stuff, and your philanthropic capital might go into the actual supply chain and delivery. So that way you're able to build a pipeline that can be commercially viable and exciting, and you're able to build you're able to invest in local innovators and entrepreneurs that are much more sustainable and actually can deliver at a much lower cost than most of your multilateral NGOs or your local NGOs can.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue to Nitida. I mean, you do a lot of interesting and innovative work, I think, in picking out those organizations that can bridge that gap and act in a manner which is additive to the system that exists. But you don't just deploy financial capital. Tell us a little bit more and why.
So I work at Rippleworks, and we're a foundation that really supports organizations who have a proven model. They're deeply committed to impact, and they're ready to scale. But they might not have the nonprofit space. We often don't give organizations any ability to invest in the organization itself. And we were started by tech entrepreneurs who realized once you figure out your product, that's only the first step. Then growing your organization internally is actually going to be key to being able to achieve scale. Because operating with 10, 20 people is very, very different than 100 or 150. Your systems at some point will start to break. You can't hack it together. You can't just use manual processes anymore. So Rippleworks actually really pairs our financial support more so with capacity building. So this is, how do I build a talent system that I can actually scale so that I'm not just accidentally finding the right people, but I'm actually being really thoughtful about that. Or maybe my data systems were highly manual. How do I think about building a data system that will scale, not just for today, but in 1 year or in 10 years, and really thinking about those foundations? And what we found is the talent is there, it's just you don't actually know who to ask. So one of the things that we have really coupled is finding experts who are willing to volunteer their time and their expertise in a way that's really meaningful. They take 10, 20 years of industry expertise from the private sector, and they help a nonprofit be able to figure out, what are your core challenges? What's the answer you need right now? And everyone always wants to build for the 10-year system. But what are the non-negotiables, great foundations of what you can do right now, which will be what you can grow on? And so we also really believe that your leaders internally, your people managers, people managing your field staff are highly critical, but we don't give them skills to be great managers, right? So that's the other thing that Rippleworks does, is we build capacity around your leadership team. Because even if you had all of the money in the world, if you don't have the right teams and systems to scale, you're going to eventually fail and trip over yourself. So we believe that you actually have to pair them together.
I think it's an important discussion to have, even in the context of organizations, private sector or other organizations, because what kept me up at night most of the time when I was playing that role was, how do I develop the next level of leadership? And how do I support partners who are leading this effort on the ground? And, because that's what is key to sustaining this. And I'll come back to you to talk about a few examples of how that can be structured when you're looking at capacity building. But let's go to you, Nishant. I think all this is great, but you've been on the front line with your work with the IF in communities where you have a partner who would have funded an effort and you've gone and figured out how to solve a problem, whether it is in education or in healthcare, some of the great work that you're doing in rural areas in that space. The pilot works. Now what?
Thank you, Balaji. First of all, I'm very, very happy and excited to be here. This is my first Charcha. Of course, session in the afternoon, 3 to 4, is it's always a challenge to keep it engaging and interesting. I can already see someone sleeping. I hope he's meditating, not sleeping. So I will try and use examples from our work on the ground to keep it engaging and hopefully, real. As my co-panelist said, there has been different forms of capital available for a longish, amount of time, and as one of the largest operating foundations focused on India, and having raised close to $400 million over the last 24 years, we have also accessed different forms of capital. Of course, with the aid shrinking, there's much more pressure on all forms of capital. But it's very important to kind of, identify those opportunities. And let me, you asked Alaa to give an example. I'll give a real example from the ground, from our work. So in the post-COVID world, as you can imagine, India had one of the longest lockdowns. The businesses of street vendors of India got completely destroyed. They are people who earn their livelihoods on a daily basis, and the streets were closed for weeks altogether, right? So we launched a program called Entrepreneur. Prerna is a Hindi word which means inspiration. How do we help these street vendors rebuild their businesses? But we were very, very sure that we want to do it at scale. So we said, well, let's put a target of 1 million street vendors across India. It's not easy. And so when we talk about capital and structuring it in a way that can help you transition from pilot to scale, I think it's less about capital and more about program design. It starts on day zero and not an afterthought. So we said, let's do that. Of course, with the amount of money that is needed to support 1 million businesses to get rebuilt is not something that we have access to. So we had to be creative. We had to leverage the blended finance that Alaa was talking about. So we designed the program, and we went to investors like HSBC and Bank of America and MacArthur Foundation and raised $2.5 million of philanthropic capital. We went to the Government of India, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, and got them to underwrite working capital loans, and went to some 22 banks, commercial banks, all banks that you know of, private sector, public sector, to kind of issue these loans. And as a result, in the last 2-3 years, based on the $2.5 million of philanthropic investment, we have unlocked $40 million of working capital loans to 850,000 street vendors across 61 cities of India. This was not possible. We could have never raised $40 million of philanthropic capital. We could have never reached 850,000 street vendors with our $2.5 million investment. So the magic was, the 16 times leverage was in using commercial finance, or leveraging it rather, which would not have happened if the philanthropic investment was not there. So these opportunities exist, and I think, as you made the point very correctly, especially in the context of India, what we see is that money is not a problem, and the government is more than willing to partner with you and be an enabler, not just with opening the doors, but also with putting their own money on the table. That's what we see increasingly. And so this whole pilot to scale transition, do it or think about it from day one, and think about how you can leverage other forms of capital available with private sector and with the public sector.
No, that's well said, and all three of you, I think, spoke to the heart of what importance of capital, but also importance of how you are designing and approaching your own organization and its mission for the long term, right? At TCS, when we were leading this effort, I think for my model was always start with intellectual capital, which is harnessing the wisdom of crowds, people who are closer to the problem, people who are regionally working on these efforts for several years. How do you gather, understand, and use that knowledge to support in building the design of the program? And more often than not, the closer you are to the hardest problems, it is hard because infrastructure doesn't exist and systems don't exist today. So how can you take some of that responsibility as a private sector organization to organize yourself for the long term, right? So you can hold the knowledge, but open source it. You make it available for people who are doing work in this space, right? And then you can bring in technology capital, which obviously everybody look at a company like DCS and say, oh, yeah, you can do that. Yes, but you can do that again targeted. If you do that against targeted issues, to your point, then the design is such that you can unlock huge potential. Like, for example, our literacy program, our first CEO, Dr. F.C. Kohli, who is the father of the IT industry, it was his dream to see a literate India, much like Mahatma Gandhi's dream. And we worked on it for 25 years, okay? The program was running really well, but at smaller pilots. We could do 2 lakh, 3 lakh, 5 lakh, people in a year. And capital was intense because government used to spend, I think, about 650 rupees per person for, not that money was available. Overall budget at the national level was about 2,000 crores or so, that's it, right? But that is the amount of money per person. So that responsibility that we had to then take on is how do you design for this along with a partner so that the unit cost and the fidelity and the ability to deliver at a local level, with the prereqs and with the community organizations and the schools. That is the key to unlocking the leverage, right? So I think that helps. And I promised to share with you what Ratnakar story. So second part of that story is that I asked him the same question. Okay, I was coming, I'm going to do this panel, so I'm like, okay, wheels are churning, let's ask this guy, because I think he has the answers, right? So I asked him, how are you going to find the capital? And even before I asked him, he said, look, there'll be some well-wishers who will fund, and there'll be, first couple of months, a few months, a year, I can run with that, but I know I can't sustain that. So the only way for me to do is to get the other women from my locality along with my mother and set up a smaller scale organization that can create something and distribute it to others and make money. So I will use the proceeds from that. I'll give them some salary, but basically I'll use the proceeds from that to go into this. I'm like, wow. It takes years for a lot of us in this space to even get to the point where we understand that, how do you build that sustainability at that local level? But then I asked him the question that I'm going to ask you, which is, okay, we do this, we are ready for scale, program is designed. How do you build the capacity? I mean, I know even for an organization, let me start with you, Nisha, even for an organization like you, suddenly if you are asked to scale from 10, 20 districts where you're doing the work to 100 districts, for example, right? The government is saying, okay, money is there, design is approved. Are you ready for it? How do you build the capacity?
I know it's a panel and there is a question that all of us have to answer, but this question is very, very pertinent to the AIF journey. We have grown 3 times in the last 8 years, from around $8 to $10 million per year of operating budget every year to around $25 million. And while this growth is very, very impressive, and we are very proud of it, in hindsight, like many other organizations, we now think that we should have invested more in the capacity, organizational capacity. And I think, to be fair, it's kind of an easy question to, or easy reflection to have now than 8 years back when we did not have the money to invest in the so-called capacity. So it's a chicken and egg issue. And I think you talked about the people issues and technology and so many other aspects of organizational capacity, which I think all of us are aware of. I want to draw your attention to a few things which I have seen become very important from an organizational capacity point of view in the last few years, beyond the technological systems to manage. So AIF grew from like having some 50 odd people 8 years back to now about 1,600 people across 35 states and union territories of India. You can't do these things. With scale also comes complexity, right? And you can't do these things manually anymore. So you need those HRMS and the CRMs and you name it. So there is absolutely no way you can deal with that level of scale and complexity with manual systems and processes. But there are 2-3 things I want to kind of really underline. One is how do you build, so on the people issue, how do you build a culture of accountability and integrity, which is not a system issue if you think of it. You can't buy a software and build it. It's a mindset issue. And I think as leaders of the organization who are trying to build an organization that is hopefully going to last a very long time and operate at scale, accountability and integrity as part of their culture is very, very important. Sometimes they just sit in the values of your organization and nothing happens. And frankly, these are not easy things to do. If you ask me what are the 3 ways in which you build accountability, I'll like, no, I don't know, right? But I'm just saying that it's very, very important. The second thing which I think is very important is compliance, especially in our sector. For a very long time, we have kind of ignored this whole aspect, and many of us are paying the price for ignoring it. So I think right from the day you start building an organization, you have to think about compliance. All companies have it. It's just that the non-profit sector kind of was taking it easy. The third thing, which I think relates to the point that I was making in my answer to the first question, is that have some dedicated capacity to engage with the governments at all levels. A lot of times we want to do it, but we just simply don't have the skills or the expertise to do it. But I think if we really want to move to operating at a scale, you have to learn how to work with the governments. When I say governments, I don't just mean the central government, but the state government, the local governments, and so on. There is no bigger player, development player than the government. There is no bigger spender of money. I don't know whether spender is the right word. You know what I mean, right? There is no player with bigger outreach than the government. So when you talk about health, when you talk about education, when you talk about livelihoods, when you talk about gender issues, and if you talk about scale, you have to work with the government. I'm not talking about private sector, that everybody knows. But government, you have to, so you have to have, I don't know, call it whatever, government relations and whatever you want to call it, but have some dedicated capacity on that.
And I think that's an important lesson for a lot of organizations to learn. And see, system and how we organize ourselves have also not evolved to the extent where there are intermediaries who do that for you for grassroots organizations. Big private sector organizations will have, because we've, in order to do, we will invest in that. So I think in thinking about your response to this capacity and knowledge infrastructure and human capital aspect, are there lessons that we can learn from what you have done in other countries or seen that we can draw here? For example, how do you share frameworks and best practices? Even knowing that this is what you need to do could be a missing link in some cases.
I would say this is something that Rippleworks is actively thinking about. So we turned 10 years old this year, and I think we've always really, one of our core principles is listening to those who are closest to the challenge. I think we always want to start with, what is your challenge today? And really trying to be a thought partner to do that and trying to address those needs. But in reality, we've also started to see trends. It's, if you don't invest in people and your people managers and good hiring practices, you will likely not hire the right people in, and you're going to start churning them out. And so I think we're trying to put together those frameworks now, but then recognizing we work globally. So every single country has its own context, and impact, and the context matters in each country. And so how can you make it general enough that it's adaptable, but not so general it's not useful? And I think this is where the dialogue is actually really important. Like, it's a framework to start the conversation, but it's a place to have a common language, to start iterating, to start asking questions. And I think as I think about, it'd be amazing if someone could come and ask you, like, this is my situation, with your knowledge, what would be your advice? And like really being open to that. I would say as an international funder, what we often say is, this is just what we've seen. You are closest to the challenge. If it doesn't resonate with you, you don't have to follow it, right? We're just sharing other perspectives. So it's that idea of being open to listening to other ideas and what might have worked somewhere else, and then thinking critically, does it make sense for you? Does it apply? And I think as you ask more and more people, you'll start to see some of the trends come in. But what we've seen is being intentional about investing in systems, being intentional about investing in people, but being able to iterate along the way. Whatever your plan is in day one, I can guarantee you this is what we've learned. In year 3, it will never look that same way. So listen to your ultimate customer, the communities you're trying to solve. They will tell you if it's working for them or not. And if it's not working, I think what we have learned is we have to be willing to ask ourselves why and change. Because otherwise, if we stick to our plans, that's actually often when we end up veering in the wrong direction.
Well said, and I think perfect tee up for Alaa. You've been the voice of the community. You've led global movements through that, and you mobilized beyond capital. I mean, you've really mobilized movements. In fact, our first interaction was when we were working on a movement to have corporates support the SDGs through volunteerism, right? So human capital has been sort of a common thread for a lot of the work that you've done. What is your view?
Yeah, and I think even at 500 Global, I mean, we ultimately invest in leaders. That is our firm belief. And I will say, I think that is the most critical lens of it. If you invest in local leadership, and I think our kind of reinforcement mechanism with the community is whether or not their venture is actually successful. Are they actually providing benefit to that community? Do they have the type of customer base that continues to invest in them as well? But you have an ability first for other local members to see leadership and what it looks like, and I think role modeling is a very powerful thing. Seeing somebody from your community be able to deliver greater impact is incredibly powerful. But then I think it meets two other things. You had spoken a little bit about getting some of the workable capital loans from banks. And the reason they did that wasn't because they were altruistic. Let's be fair. It was because there was strong incentive for them as well. It meant they were getting more companies into their systems, right? And they would end up getting a significant financial incentive. So it made them more sustainable as well. And I think every time we think about local leadership or impact or capacity building, there's two questions we should be asking. Number one, what is the level of agency? Because agency is pretty critical for somebody to feel like they can continue to do the work and have the autonomy and the leadership to do it. And the second is, what's the incentive? Because if you can figure out people's incentives, you can figure out how to make any constellation of partnerships work. And ultimately, I think that's what capacity building is you will have some people on your team who are there and need support from a systems level. You'll have some people who, to your point, are very effective at government relations and engagement and might not be your systems person, right? And to be able to create a constellation that's really effective for your institution, for the work, and ultimately the impact, I think comes down to kind of those two questions. And then the third being, how do you then invest in it? Is it financial? Is it time? Is it expertise, like your expert committee? What does it look like to truly invest in is kind of the second piece of that.
Yeah, wow. I'm trying to integrate a lot of your questions, amazing questions. I think we can do a whole panel on this itself and probably spend the rest of the day here. But believe me, I'm trying to integrate a lot of what you have put into my questions to these wonderful panelists. But I'll share a few so that as we go through the third leg of our stool, which is on collaboration and building ecosystem, right? We can try to address some of this. Some of the questions are around funding streams that support a diverse range of stakeholders. How do philanthropies focus more on trust-based, unrestricted funding? I think it's a favorite question that we get asked every time in these sort of forums. What is the danger of blended models, right? Does it take away from grants and having the ability for nonprofits to test and fail? Because to your point, right, the incentives for those larger organizations that are putting in the capital is to see, stable returns. And even if you are organizing the first risk capital through philanthropy or other means, that is taking away probably from innovation. So mull over some of these questions. There are questions around enablers for scale with impact. How do small group learnings scale up? So I think very intelligent audience. Would love to see some of you be on this side and share your thoughts as part of the panel next time around. So keeping that in mind, let's start to do a little bit more of a quick fire, right? We have about 20 minutes to unpack some of these questions as well as ecosystem, right? Collaboration. Are there real ecosystems that work at scale? And if so, where are you seeing this? What are good examples of where you can look at and say that, okay, there is grassroots impact, there is agency, there is different forms of capital, there is leadership from community organizations, and the government support to scale up. So quick fire, and then I'll come back to the questions around collaboration. Any of you?
I can start. I was going to say, just at my time at Charcha, I think I'm super excited for India. I think you have a lot of the components that can make a really robust ecosystem. You have examples of nonprofits who are partnering with governments effectively, governments giving money to organizations, like putting real skin in the game. And just as an organization, we support a lot of organizations in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm looking at how CSR is partnering with philanthropies, partnering with private sector, and I'm actually very excited for India. So just in terms of an ecosystem, I know when you're in it, you see all of the negatives, all the things that don't work, all the frustrations, but as an outsider looking in, there is so much potential in India, and it's so exciting to hear everyone talking about how to bring more proximate voices to the work and how to connect and get government involved and really take ownership as we all want them to take. So that, I mean, that was, yeah.
I think, hearing this is also important for this audience, that, we have this belief in India that, yeah, we're doing something that's very unique and it's going to, change the world, grassroots up. But it's also important to hear from this other side that these are models where others are looking in from outside and saying, okay, there is excitement, there are things that are happening, let's learn from that. So just double clicking on that, are there ways to do knowledge sharing that you think audience here and organizations can benefit from beyond conferences?
I think Charcha is trying to do this as well, is trying to connect real implementers who are working in similar models across geographies. At school one year, I was there, and there were a bunch of organizations, including Rocket Learning, who were working at early childhood. We also had other organizations we worked with in Kenya, in South Africa, and Botswana. And they knew of each other, but they didn't actually have a connection. And so all we had to do is, in a lunch that we had, I said, that's the person you want to meet? That's them right there. And by the end of the week, they were actually creating a working group across borders. And they were talking about, how do we test our early childhood education? How do we know the outcomes are where we're getting? And me as a person, I just knew who they were in the room. And so there were just simple connections to get people who are doing the real work to be able to talk. So I think that's one of the things that we can try to do as we listen, is get past like the details of our work and get to the commonalities and really see what the opportunities are.
Wonderful. I like how this is going organically. Yeah.
I think in this conversation, I want to acknowledge, first of all, that non-profit work is not easy. I know many of you work in non-profit sector. It's not easy. We work in difficult geographies. We work to solve intractable problems. We would not be there, or our work would not be required if these problems were easy to solve. There are capital availability issues. I say this, that non-profits are by definition resource constrained organizations, because it doesn't matter how much funding you have, your ambition is always greater than the funding. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. The second thing I think I want to say is that when we talk about ecosystem, and this is a word which gets used very, very, very much in the last few years, there is always this pressure to somehow say, okay, I see this problem, I think I know how to solve this problem, or I know how this problem can be solved, and therefore I need to build this ecosystem because I on my own cannot do this. But I think that's too much for a non-profit to think about. What we have learned is that there are already ecosystems or nascent ecosystems, or there are systems which are probably not working very well because there is this small gap in how things should operate, and therefore the efforts are not kind of syncing up. And it's much more efficient and effective for a non-profit to identify that piece and work to plug that hole, rather than take on the mantle of trying to build the ecosystem, because it's not easy. Just going back to the example of Entrepreneur, the program that I was talking about before. I mean, think about this. It has private sector funders, as in like investors or funders, in HSBC and Bank of America and MacArthur and others. Then it has public sector, so the ministry, and then of course the local urban bodies in the 61 cities that I'm talking about. Then it has the private sector element, fintech firms that we worked with for easy, quick application disbursement and repayment of the loans that we are talking about. So there's a whole bunch of, and the 22 banks that we are talking about, right? So there's a whole bunch of players who need to come together for something like this. But as you said very clearly, all the banks, banks have an incentive. It is their job to disburse loans, right? But there was something missing. That something could be as easy as, this street vendor does not have the right paperwork. Can you fix that? If you fix that, then I'm willing to give him loan, right? And so you fix that by using the philanthropic money. So don't feel burdened that you have to build the ecosystem. Systems are there. There are players with different mandates. All we have to do is to creatively work together to bring them together and plug the holes that you identify.
Yeah, and I'll actually pick up on both your comments. The first is learning beyond borders. We run programs for entrepreneurs, and our intent is to actually bring them from different parts. So we have a program in Nairobi where we have brought entrepreneurs in ag tech and clean tech and from across the continent, and they get to learn from each other. They get to see what the positives, the challenges, and I think there's a level of having community that can be very exciting because you realize I'm not in this alone. I'm not building alone. But second to that, the ecosystem question is always so interesting to me because I don't think that people think there's some sort of magical unicorn ecosystem where everything just works perfectly, and that's just not true. I mean, I can think of so many sectors where you have really compelling building blocks, right? Like right now, agriculture is very interesting. The whole entire food and nutrition security space is very interesting. You have so many things so many compounding factors that are making it exciting to work in that space. And yet, I think the most successful people, the most successful groups will be the ones who look at, okay, what's the market failure? You have all these different people who are all committed to the same goal, and why isn't it working? Because there's a lot of money in it right now. There's a lot of ambition. There's so many nonprofits. There's incentives across every level of leadership. So where is the market failure? Because I think that is actually what makes it much more successful. And then how do I help bridge that gap? Is it, yes, philanthropic financing? Is it capacity building? Is it bringing in lessons from other contexts? Is it local leadership and investing in local leadership? Is it looking at nonprofits that can help us with advocacy and communications and awareness? Is it looking at local entrepreneurs that can help us with last mile delivery or investment? But there is that element of this exists. We don't exist in the world alone. We don't operate in the world alone. And so if we're doing anything, it is being able to say, okay, how can I align different people to a shared mission or shared vision? And what's the missing ingredient that could incentivize people differently?
And when you think about that, who should lead it, right? So I think one of the interesting things I noticed when the international aid structure started getting pressured, especially being at UNGA this year and interacting with a lot of leaders, is especially from those receiving aid, there was this moment, right? Okay, now finally we get to set the table. Finally, we get to define how our destiny should be as countries or as communities. India, I think, is in a very interesting space where I think the economic growth is powering a lot of this. So our challenge may be a little different, but how do we make sure that in building this ecosystem and aligning all these players, we don't lose sight of Ratnakar and people like him in the community? How do you do that?
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, the aid debate, we were talking about this earlier, but I think sometimes we oversimplify things. So when a lot of the questions were surrounding aid, people are like, okay, great, now we can really reshape the system, and this is our time. It is true, there are huge inefficiencies, but it's also true that there was millions of lives saved, right? And so I don't think we should completely say out with aid. I think we should recognize, how do we make it more efficient? How do we leverage it to be able to bring in new partners, new financing, create that risk kind of pillar? But in terms of how to be more involved, this might be a controversial answer, but it is through leadership. Ultimately, it's been interesting to talk to national NGOs or subnational NGOs who talk about really reshaping the aid architecture. For the vast majority of the conversation, it's going into let's have more bilateral aid and conversations with other governments. So if you as an NGO are not influencing your government, it's very unlikely your voice is going to be heard by another government that's reconstituting its aid infrastructure, right? So it's really starting, what is your sphere of power and influence, and how do you leverage that effectively, would be the first thing I would say. And then the second is, and I fully agree with you, I started in the nonprofit space. It is a critical lever of influence. But it's not the only lever of influence. And so I think as we increasingly think about how to make development sustainable, a question of leaders who are interested in political roles, leaders who are interested in commercial roles, should be in those roles and bring the mentality of impact and development and community with them, right? And that's a very critical. We need more physicians who are in government talking about where aid should go. We need more we need more teachers talking about education from a government procurement and appropriations perspective. Because the more we have experts who know these issues intimately, making the decisions about where these massive budgets go and where we shape the conversation, the more powerful it is. So I would say start with your sphere of influence, really try to influence your local government, your local decision makers, and then frankly become your local government and decision makers.
Yeah, I think beautiful segue to our final topic, which is how do you envision a future where nobody is left behind? I know you have an answer to this question, so I'm going to throw this along with that, right? Because see, some of you may think, okay, is this going to be what India will experience? But you will already experience this. Those who have been working in the NGO sector for the last 20, 30 years, you will see the power dynamic has shifted. And a lot of you look at CSR organizations and companies and say that, okay, you have the voice. Why don't you advocate? But do you really understand the challenges? Can you represent as well? So I think what you're sharing, is very relevant in terms of thinking about where that power lies, where the voice comes from, and how to adequately represent it. And for that, your own leadership has to grow in terms of not only thinking about you, your organization, and what you can do, but the larger mission of what you're representing and the voice of others whom you're representing. So last quick fire question. Envision a future for us. I'm not going to leave you without thinking about the future, right? Grassroots impact, population scale. What does it look like? A minute or less.
I'm going to first answer the question that you never asked me, which is this whole ecosystem. I mean, for as long as I have been in the social impact sector, which is now 25 years, I've heard this debate whether NGOs should work on the ground and serve people, serve individuals, or they should operate at the ecosystem level. And I think what I have learned is that it's a false debate. It's a waste of time debate. Because I think the work with individuals is required to create that lessons, the evidence, to be able to advocate at a more ecosystem level. And ecosystem work is required if you want to achieve impact at scale. So both are equally important. Of course, as an organization, as a leader, you can make a choice, not necessarily an exclusive choice or mutually exclusive choice, based on your competitive advantage, based on the role that you think you can play in the. But don't get kind of intellectually confused whether you should. Both are important. And I think going back, I mean the question that you did ask me, what's my vision? I think overall, it's very simple for me. We work in some of the most underserved tribal, rural geographies and communities of India. And we do lots of things, but everything that we do is meant for one thing, at least for me. That's the guiding force, which is that a child waking up in a small village in tribal Odisha or Chhattisgarh has access to good quality health, education, and when she grows up, good quality, full of dignity and security livelihoods. Everything else, otherwise, if that is not happening, then everything else is meaningless.
Alaa and Nitida, your final thoughts? Same question. Grassroots impact, population scale. Make it real. What does it look like? Vision for the future.
I mean, I think my hope is that all voices are heard and are incorporated. I think one of the things I really envision is we're all connected to each other. And if one of us is hurting, all of us is hurting. So how do we bring those voices that are often left outside and what their needs are actually brought up to the top? So maybe AI is the answer, but it's like, how do we incorporate all those millions of voices who are actually needing all of us to work together? Yeah, I think that's the vision, is somehow we remember that each of us is interconnected to each other.
Alaa?
So starting as a activist and then having worked in some of the most complex countries and contexts in the world, I tend to say be mission specific but tactic agnostic or platform agnostic. So my mission in life is that every child can survive past the age of 5 from preventable causes of death, and every woman has access to opportunities and has agency to live a life of her choice. And I will do that through any mechanism. And I think if you are currently in a nonprofit, there's a million ways to do it. If you are in a for-profit, if you are in government, but if you're pretty mission specific about leaving the world better than you found it, I think it can be very powerful because it opens up a whole range of tactics that you can use and skill sets that you can employ. And I think second to that would be being very honest with yourself about what resources you have, what network you have, what access you have, what is your sphere of power, and how can you leverage your sphere of power, your voice, your influence, whatever it might be, to create space for others who are not in the room. I think that is daily kind of an assignment of, okay, well, if I am in these communities, who isn't? How do I create better opportunity and shape it differently for generations after me? But I think regardless of what your faith background is, if you have one, the golden rule is a pretty good one to follow. Treat others as you would want to be treated, and frankly, leave the world better than you found it.
That's amazing. I think these are essential truths that bind us together. In this world where we often see a lot of fragmentation, challenges, I think there is more that brings us together than what divides us. And my vision is one where we can build leaders, we can build teams, we can build institutions that can serve society with humility and a pioneering spirit. Whether it is in Samaj, Sarkar or Bazaar, I think development for India, for the world, is our common goal. That's what binds us together. So, and I think it's inspiring to be in a room like this and with speakers like this who share that vision. So thanks for a highly engaged audience, other than the person who's still not awake. But, I can relate.
We failed. It was a great conversation, but we failed to wake him up.
Thanks for being such an engaged audience, and thanks Alaa, Nishant and Nitida. Thank you.